This podcast is being sponsored by White Rose Blackman Solicitors, a highly respected firm of solicitors based in Leeds, specialising in civil litigation, commercial litigation, criminal law, family law, housing disrepair, immigration law, landlord and tenant, personal injury, and wills and probate. They have a team of specialist solicitors and barristers in all their practice areas that can assist. They represent clients across England and Wales and are nationally recognised for their numerous awards, such as Criminal Law Lawyers of the Year 2021. They have a 5-star rating on Review Solicitors and were also awarded the Best Business of 2021 Excellence Award and have a Lexel Legal Practice Mark, which is accredited by the Law Society. Head on to their website at www.whiteroseBlackmans.co.uk if you require any legal assistance, and do make sure to give them a follow on Facebook and Twitter. Our today's guest requires no introduction. You will have seen him more recently on your TV screens and on the front page of the newspapers, taking a stand against the government and fighting for the interests of criminal barristers.
Some who are in the criminal bar want to serve the public. We've been doing so for decades. But this government, which has no plan for the criminal justice system, and which has neglected it for so long, expects us to continue to do their bidding without us being respected as men and women who are professional people, who have sacrificed so much to do the job that they love.
He's a leading King's Counsel specialising in serious crime and human rights, former chairman of the Criminal Bar Association, member of the Equality and Inclusion Committee, and lead advocacy trainer with the Honourable Society of Lincoln's Inn. He was also the winner of the Asian Professional of the Year award and voted as one of top 101 most influential Asians in the UK. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Jo Sidhu King's Counsel. Hello, Jo, and welcome to the latest with Law Simplified. It's an absolute honour to have you join us today.
It's my pleasure, Farid.
Thank you. Have you had a good day today, Jo?
Yes, I have. A busy day for someone like myself. Although the barristers are on strike at the moment, it doesn't mean that we don't work. So yes, I've had a few things to sort out in the course of the day.
Excellent. So I think we should perhaps get started. What do you think?
Absolutely. Let's crack on.
Now, I want to start off by addressing your journey to the bar. And we've heard you say in previous interviews that you've not had a conventional journey to the bar. I know that you studied philosophy, politics and economics at University of Oxford. You then went on to study masters in politics of the world economy in LSE. What then made you want to become a barrister?
Well, Farin, these days, those people who come to the bar come from very different walks of life. So we have a very diverse intake. And that means not just in terms of, the fact that we have men and women, we have people from different minorities, different classes. We also have a large number of people who did not do a law degree, and I'm one of them. So about 50% of the intake of new barristers in the profession are people who graduated in a subject other than law. So in my particular case, I had no interest at all in being a lawyer until I was about 24 or 25. And this is notwithstanding the fact that when I was 18 and just finished my A-levels and before I was about to go to Oxford to start my degree as a first-year fresher, I got called up for jury service in what was called Acton Crown Court. It doesn't exist anymore. But I ended up on a jury for 2 different trials over 2 weeks. And I got to watch very closely how barristers do their job in criminal court. So the whole drama and all the costumes and the way in which they present themselves. And I found it very amusing and entertaining. But not once did it cross my 18-year-old mind that this is something that one day I'd end up doing myself. So I pursued my studies in social sciences, and my original interest was to join the United Nations and do development work in poorer countries. Because I had a particular interest in politics and economics, I wanted to combine the two into political economy and work out what was necessary for governments to do both internationally and within their own borders to help poor people basically lift themselves up and get out of the sort of ruinous cycle of poverty that kept so many of them behind. Now, that was my aspiration. I wanted to be one of those people who helped. And as a young man, all I thought about was how I could get out of the UK and into developing countries and do that work in the field. But in the end, having pursued my postgraduate studies, and that included starting a doctorate for a year, which I had a scholarship for, and then abandoning it after 1 year and turning to law, I resolved that the best thing I could do with myself actually was to be a barrister. And what really propelled me in that direction was the idea that what do criminal barristers do day to day? They are advocates. They use their voices. They use the way in which they articulate concepts and explain evidence to audiences like juries. And it seemed to me that that was a fantastic way to have a career and to build a vocation in public service. And so my interest was not to make money out of being a barrister. I didn't gravitate towards areas of law that are very well remunerated, like private work, commercial work, and that sort of thing. It wasn't for me. What really mattered was going out there, standing up for the little people in the world against the state where they needed support and help, and have a voice in me to represent them in court, even though I knew that that would be doing legal aid work, which I'm sure we'll be talking about, is pretty poorly paid. And for me, it was a sacrifice I was willing to make at that time as a junior barrister, because ultimately, if I could do something to help people who are relatively disadvantaged in the criminal justice system, that would be a sufficient reward for me to go to work every day.
It brings me on to the next question, actually. Now, the criminal justice system has gone through quite a lot of turbulence in the past sort of decade. There's been underinvestment in court. We've seen quite significant legal aid cuts since 2011, which has hugely impacted a lot of practitioners at the criminal bar. Do you have any regrets in terms of your career choice or your decision to practice crime?
I personally don't regret having done criminal work, because I've derived a huge amount of satisfaction from being involved in the criminal justice system. The people that I've met along the way, the men and women who are prosecutors and defenders, are an extraordinary bunch of professionals. They have really strong personalities. They are not slow about expressing their opinions and views, just the kind of people that I like to hang out with. So my decision all those years ago, and it was back in 1993 that I started my pupillage, was, to my mind, a good decision to make. Of course, across these last nearly 30 years, there have been huge changes within the system that for a youngster or a junior barrister starting out in their career would give them pause for thought, make them perhaps rethink whether this was such a good idea after all. And what we've seen, Farine, very, very sadly, is that a lot of people who came into the profession with good intentions, wanting to do their bit for public service as a prosecutor or a defender, have realized slowly and to their great dismay that it's simply not possible to carve out a viable job as a criminal barrister on the fees that they're being paid. But for my part, because I missed in my early days that particular problem of the real terms decrease in fees, by the time I got to a stage where the real term decrease in fees was really beginning to bite, I was already so advanced down the road in my profession. So it was a bit too late for me to turn back and do something else. But regrets wise, I mean, I have to say, when I first applied for pupillage, I had 2 offers. I was lucky enough to get 2 offers. One was from a criminal set of chambers, a tier 1 leading set in London. And the other was from a set that did medical negligence, because I had an interest in medicine. I have a number of doctors in the family, and it always occurred to me that actually one of the things that might keep me intellectually curious is working in cases where doctors would be involved. And before I'd come to a settled conclusion about which of the 2 offers to take, I had the opportunity to speak to a person who became a Lord Justice of Appeal and is now retired. I bumped into him accidentally when I was in Gray's Inn, And I asked him if he could give me some advice, and he was cheerful enough to say, absolutely, what would you like to know, young man? And I said to him, well, I have these two offers, and I'm not sure which one I should take. I know that doing medical negligence would be intellectually stimulating and probably very well paid, but at the same time, you know, crime is a big attraction for me, and I'd like to be able to do something there as well, and I don't know which one to opt for. He asked me a simple question. He said, young man, what was the reason why you decided to change direction in your life and become a barrister? To which I responded, well, that's an easy one. It's because I always wanted to be an advocate in court. And he said to me, well, then you've answered your own question. And of course, what he meant was that as a medical negligence barrister, I probably wouldn't spend that much time in court fighting cases, because most of those cases are negotiated towards a settlement. But with criminal cases, I'd have my dream come true, which was to spend time battling away in cases involving serious offences. So it was a good piece of advice, and I therefore don't really have any regrets. What I do regret is the state of the system now for all the other young hopefuls who wanted to come in and make their contribution and simply cannot, because of the way in which the system has been neglected for so long, as you've mentioned.
Sure. And we're going to discuss that in a moment, but I think it sort of can be said that this was destiny, Jo. You were destined to be a criminal barrister. And perhaps it sort of, if we can move on to the next question then, because I think, again, it ties in very nicely. You were elected as a chairman of the Criminal Bar Association. Many congratulations from Law Simplified on serving a successful term. Now, you were elected in September of 2021. Now, for people that don't know, as a chairman, you are responsible for representing the views and the interests of criminal barristers, and to an extent, of course, preserving the independent criminal bar. Why did you want to be the man that took up the fight against the government to save this failing criminal justice system? Because your manifesto that you delivered, that you received a mandate on, covered a lot of things about the action that was necessary because of the cuts that we've seen. Why did you want to be that man, Jo?
Well, I've always enjoyed, Farine, taking on a representative role, whether it's on an individual single case in court, whether it's a murder, and I typically do murder cases when I'm trialing as an advocate, or whether it's representing people in the community. I mean, I've had all sorts of incredibly, important and useful experiences. I have been the chair of my old primary school governing body for more than 20 years, and I only stepped down a few years ago. I was the president of the Society of Asian Lawyers for 3 years. So that was the largest minority ethnic lawyers association in the country. That was a great privilege as well, being able to try and look after their interests. So stepping up to become the chair of the Criminal Bar Association was, in a sense, a natural progression for me because of the instinct that I had for wanting to support and help people within the profession. I started as the vice chair in September 2020, and then moved up from there to the chair's position in September 2021. Now, when you become the chair of the Criminal Bar Association, you know that you're taking on a huge responsibility. There's upwards of 3,000 criminal barristers in the country. And of course, they are at the sharp end of the justice system. They are probably the most poorly paid because of the low legal aid fee rates. They're working within a system which we're all wearily familiar has become a system that's crumbling, it's cracking, it's falling to pieces. Courts are now drafty, things don't work, the heating is off or the heating is on, the toilets are in a terrible state. And it's a real shame, because for a country that really prides itself on the quality of justice that it delivers, the infrastructure that we were working within was a poor reflection of the great and noble intentions that we had in years and decades gone past. So I was fully aware that when I took on this role, I would be in a big battle with government to make sure that two things happened. One, that we had sufficient investment within the criminal justice system. That means ensuring that we had courts that were functioning properly and that were safe environments for us to work in. Secondly, that we would have the supporting system around us. That's the court staff, the judiciary, the probation services, the prison services, and everybody else who's involved in ensuring that from day to day our courts are able to function normally. And that means that there has to be sufficient investment in that as well. But part of that, Farine, is making sure that barristers who do crime are paid properly for the work that they do, and that they are not actually exploited as they have been for at least the last 15 years. And so when I took on this role, I was fully aware that I was stepping into an arena which would bring me potentially into conflict with government, whose policy had clearly been over many, many years to disinvest in the criminal justice system and to allow real incomes of criminal barristers to decline steadily year on year because they were being eroded by inflation and there were no increases in our fees. So I knew that I was biting off a big chunk. But for me, life is about challenge. For me, life is about standing up for people who need to be supported. And for me, you have to be sometimes quite courageous and boneheaded, frankly, if you're going to take on the edifice of a government which is used to getting its own way. And so this was a challenge which, in a sense, I relished, but it has been an enormous responsibility. But I'll say this much, Farine, no human being, man, woman, can do this job and do it in a way with the support of the membership, as we have seen during the time that I've been chair of the Criminal Bar Association, unless you have those thousands of women and men who are the rank and file criminal barristers who do the job day in, day out, behind you, supporting you and pushing you to go further and faster to make sure that their livelihoods and the sustainability of the system are protected and preserved in the face of a government which is intransigent and unwilling to do what is necessary by way of investment. And that means that the role I've played has been to put myself between our membership and government and to be their ears and eyes and to be their spokesperson with the Ministry of Justice in particular and with the Secretaries of State, and indeed when dealing with the judiciary and all our other partners in the system, including the CPS and the various stakeholders, not to forget solicitors who work within the criminal field, with whom I've developed a very strong and close relationship, and their leaders particularly. And that's important because I felt it was part of my function, if not my mission, to try and bring together all the constituent elements of the criminal justice system, all the human beings who keep it alive day in, day out, in a way that meant that everyone would have confidence that we're going in the right direction. I feel that that mission has been to a large extent achieved, but it's not been achieved by me alone. It's been achieved by me working with my officers, with the executive, and very importantly, with the support of the members who feel, I hope, that they have had the opportunity to express themselves in a more democratic association, because I try to change things to make it more transparent, more democratic, and to make people like myself more accountable.
Now, you've been at the bar for nearly 30 years. You have led an extremely successful career at the bar. Do you have any personal highlights, Jo?
Well, I've had many, many highlights in terms of the kinds of cases that I've been involved in, Farine, because I tell you what's really strange about this job. You could be in court at the Old Bailey during the day, and then you go home. And like any other normal person, you go home, you might shower, change into your clothes at home, have your dinner, settle down in front of the television if you've got time to catch up with the news. And then you see the case that you've been dealing with that same day on BBC News at 10. And this is one of the strange things about this job, is that you almost exist in a sort of dual persona. You've got your working day where you are actually in the middle of the cauldron, you're part of the process, the story is unraveling around you, and you're influencing that story because you're cross-examining or you're making a speech, you're trying to persuade people around to your client's way of thinking. And then you become almost a bystander when you watch those same cases on television. And then you think, oh, that's an interesting case. And it's almost as though you're forgetting that is your own case. And I think there is something extraordinary about criminal work, because it's very rare in other divisions of law. If you think about commercial cases or family cases, employment cases, personal injury cases, tax cases, it's very rare that any of those cases ever surface in the media or end up on the news. But because there is this insatiable public appetite for learning more about crime and criminals, you get far more coverage within both the digital media, TV, radio, and of course print media, newspapers, than any other area of law. So it's one of the highlights of the job that I do, that there is a sense of engagement with the wider public, because they have this, insatiable desire to be consuming more and more information about what's happening with big criminal cases. And if you're a part of that, then you're part of a story. You're making that story happen. And it means that the end of the story isn't foretold. The end of the story is what it will become, with all the input of people like yourself and others who are in the trial process, actually creating a narrative for a jury to consider. And then they make up their own minds about whether the person is guilty or not guilty. And I think it's a great privilege to be part of that, because often when I'm doing my case, I remind myself that I'm doing a murder case. If this goes wrong for my client, this person, this human being, is going to be in a prison cell for possibly the next 25, 30 plus years. That's a long time to be confined and incarcerated. And whilst they may be guilty, it's still a huge burden, both on them, and it's also a burden on the advocate, who's doing their very best for them to try and get them a good outcome. So none of us, myself or any other criminal barrister, ever forgets that weight on our shoulders, that you are doing something that's really important. I always say to younger barristers, or students indeed, who are thinking about coming to the bar and not sure whether they should do crime or something else, the way I always say it is, look, there's three things that people fight about in our courts in this country. They fight about money, so it could be commercial cases or personal injury or whatever else it happens to be. They fight about their children in family courts when they're looking to get a residence order or custody, and that can be very fractious at times. And thirdly, they fight about liberty, and that's what our criminal courts are really all about. And for me, of those three things, in terms of how to fashion a career, how to have a job that, in fact, every single day excites you and frightens you and drives you and pushes you to be better and better and better, fighting about someone's liberty, trying to protect someone from going to prison for a very long period of time, is a prize worth fighting for. I'd much rather be doing that with my time in a working day than trying to earn more money for a private corporation that's suing another private corporation for millions of pounds. For me, that's not inherently or intrinsically exciting, but trying to stop somebody going to prison for a very long time certainly is.
Crime is area of law that is life-changing. There are real lives involved, as you put it so nicely, Jo. I think we could perhaps move on to a bit of a conversation about the strike action. Now, I think you've already addressed it, Jo. There's been a lot of news. We've seen you in the news so many times. We've seen barristers demonstrating outside of criminal courts. And from the 5th of September, there is now an indefinite strike until a resolution is reached. Can you tell our audiences why criminal barristers have taken such a drastic step?
It's very difficult for the public to imagine criminal barristers, or indeed any barristers, going on strike. It's a strange thing to visualize. I mean, they're used to seeing train drivers on strike, or other people who have got a complaint against the government, who come from skilled professions, semi-skilled professions, or manual professions, but they're not used to seeing what's regarded generally as an elite profession of lawyers, barristers, out on the streets, on the pavement, outside courts with placards and shouting loudly and using megaphones to say that the government is treating them very badly indeed. That's a really weird thing for, I think, most members of the British public to conceptualize, but that's where we are. And the reason why we're there is actually rather simple. We've had such a gross neglect of the criminal justice system by successive governments over the last 2 decades in particular, that we've reached now what must be described as a predictable crisis. This was entirely foreseeable, because if you starve a system of resources for long enough, that system will end up on its knees, and it's there for all to see. Anyone who's been into a Crown Court recently will have observed, as indeed the media have observed, how poor the condition is of our courts infrastructure. We've got leaking roofs, heating that doesn't work, air conditioning that doesn't come on when it needs to, toilets that are, and in such a terrible state, nobody wants to use them, canteens that have been shut down, furniture that's broken, all sorts of problems, which really are, frankly, an embarrassment to a country like ours, which has prided itself over not just years, but decades, if not centuries, as setting the gold standard for how justice is delivered in court. And here we are now operating in what appears to be third world conditions, the kind of conditions that in fact would drive most people to leave a job. Part of that story has also been the fact that incomes for criminal barristers have been so badly declining for the last 2 decades that many people have been forced to give the job up altogether. Just to give you an idea, in the last 15 years, there's been a 28% reduction in the real incomes of criminal barristers. I mean, that's 28%. That's a huge reduction. And that's because there's been no significant or notable increase in our fees over that last 15 years. And inflation has corroded the value of what we earn. And so in a sense, we're in a different position to most other workers who are in the public sector, those who earn their incomes from taxpayers' money, as we do, because we are paid through legal aid. We're in a different position because we haven't had any increases at all to speak of. And so we've had this steady, constant drop in our real incomes. Whilst the cost of living has gone up, we've been less able to keep up and to pay for all the things that people take for granted: your shopping, your fuel bills, your energy bills, your mortgage, your rent, and all the other things that ordinary people up and down the country expect to have to pay. Now, when the pandemic struck, that simply compounded everything. Because when the pandemic struck, we were, for a period of time, shut out of court. And for the rest of that year in 2020, the courts were on a go slow, necessarily, because we had to have social distancing. And so cases were proceeding much, much more slowly. And so as self-employed professionals who only get paid at the end of a case and only get paid if you go to court, that meant that many of us were forced into debt. 81% of criminal barristers started having to borrow money to get through each month to pay for their bills. And similarly, many criminal barristers had to dip into their savings, which they kept aside for a rainy day. Now, that shouldn't be happening to any worker, still less to a highly skilled professional like a barrister, but it happened to us. So on top of that 28% decline over the last 15 years, we had a further 23% cut in our real average earnings during the period of the pandemic. And you can only imagine the toll that that would have taken on criminal barristers up and down the country. Now, market forces being what they are, what then happened was that over the last few years, last 5 years in particular, we saw that there was a 25% reduction in our workforce. 1 in 4 criminal barristers simply couldn't do the job anymore. And that's a huge depletion in human resources. So market forces were operating on the ground. I know that this government's particularly fond of market forces. It seems to think that market forces sorts out all sorts of problems. Well, here we had an example of where those same forces, because of the very low rates of pay, were driving skilled professionals out of criminal work and into other pockets of work like family, employment law, whatever other kind of law, but not criminal legal aid work. And that's how market forces really bite hard on the system. At the same time, Farine, what we were seeing was a build-up of cases in the backlog in the Crown Courts. This build-up started not when the pandemic kicked off, as the government is only too keen to pretend. That build-up started in 2019, when the government deliberately stopped judges from hearing cases in court in order to save money. So judges were sitting in their rooms, they were drumming their fingers on the table, not able to go into court and do a day's work because they were being told that that would cost too much money. And so what happened was the waiting list of cases, just as you have in the NHS, if you don't have enough doctors or surgeons, you're going to have a build-up of a waiting list. And so it happened in our system as well. More and more cases got blocked up in the system. By the time we got to 2020, when the pandemic broke, in around March of 2020, the build-up of the backlog had reached 41,000 cases. And of course, the pandemic added to that, because the slowdown in the system, by the time we got to June of 2021, the backlog was 60,000 cases. So you've got two forces operating here: a steady decline in the number of barristers willing to do criminal legal aid work, reduced by, as I say, a quarter over the last 5 years, and a steady increase in the number of cases stuck in the backlog. And the consequence of that for the people who are hanging, on the criminal justice system to have their day in court, the victims, the defendants, the witnesses, was absolutely catastrophic. Just to give you an idea of how bad it is today. So here we are in 2022, and we have an average of more than 700 days for a person to have to wait for their case to be heard in court if they are a victim or a defendant. If you happen to be, unfortunately, a woman who suffered a rape, you could expect to wait more than 1,500 days for your case to be resolved from the time that the offence is committed to the date when the case finally gets to a conclusion. That can be upwards of 5 years of waiting. And it's the reason why so many women, upwards of half of women who've complained of rape, end up sadly walking away from prosecutions with their hands in the air saying, I'm so sorry, I can't do this anymore, because the stress and the anxiety of being kept waiting for so long means that my whole life is on hold and I can't tolerate that, so I'm going to walk away. And so a person who may have been a rapist effectively gets away with it. And this is a government that's willing to condone that reality because they have failed to invest in the system adequately, in the men and women who do the work on a day-to-day basis, and in the infrastructure that would keep our courts going. That's why I felt it was really important to take a stand on behalf of the criminal bar, but also more broadly on behalf of the system, for criminal solicitors, for those who work as court staff, for those who are trying to run the system, that we needed to say to government, enough is enough. We can't keep doing this job. You are exploiting our labor. We're doing things for free, written work and drafting, which we're never paid for. And then all the hours that we toil, working evenings, nights, weekends for a pittance. People who are being paid £96 to go to court for a day's work, out of which they've got to pay their train fare, they've got to pay their dues to chambers, they've got to pay their tax. They're left with not only sometimes little to nothing in their pocket, many of those people were effectively working at a loss. Now, you cannot expect human beings to work like that, particularly those who have come into the profession most recently, the juniors who are carrying sometimes 60, 70,000 pounds worth of debt. And I must say this as well, Farine, very much, and it's very close to my heart, has been the plight of our junior barristers who have suffered the most in all of this. Their dreams have been dashed because they came in with good intentions, only to discover that they were being royally exploited by government, which wasn't prepared to pay them properly for the work that they did. Many of them became so disheartened that they simply left the work. Those same juniors, we've seen 40% of those criminal juniors last year actually left doing criminal work. And there were 300 criminal barristers last year who left in the space of that 1 year. And that was a quadrupling of the rate of attrition that we experienced on the year before. So what we're seeing is not just people leaving, but they're leaving at a faster rate. They're literally running away from criminal work. And the faster they run away from criminal work, for reasons which are entirely understandable, it means the consequences for all those victims, those defendants, and those witnesses who are caught up in the web that is the criminal justice system. Those same people will be suffering for longer and longer unless this government actually does something about this crisis and treats it as a national emergency, which is what we've been saying all along, rather than burying its head in the sand and pretending that somehow it will all resolve itself, because it won't. So, Farine, the official figures for somebody in the first 3 years of their practice as a criminal barrister, so a junior who started out up to 3 years, the median income that they will earn is £12,200. Now, when you convert that into what it would look like if you had a standard 40-hour week, that converts into just £6.25 an hour. That's outrageous. That's illegal. That's way below minimum wage. And it means that those same people who are working for such a pittance are being left to fend for themselves and to figure out how they can pay their student loan, how they can pay their bills, etc., etc. Many of them are living in cities like London. And we all know the cost of living in a city like London as a metropolis is quite considerable, and they simply can't make ends meet. So what is the typical life for somebody like that? If you asked a junior barrister, and I've been very keen to make sure that the voices of those junior barristers are heard above all other voices, above silks like myself, above the senior end, It's those junior barristers upon whom we rely to have a diverse profession of the future, and giving them an opportunity to express how they feel and talk about their typical days has been critical to changing public opinion about the merits of our action. We've seen a real change in attitudes from the media and from the public about what we're doing. We're moving way away now from the idea that, oh, it's just those fat cats asking for more money. When they realize that these younger people are earning 12,200 a year as a median income, they compare that to someone working in Amazon or someone working in Lidl's who will be earning more than them. And so this has become more than just, a joke. This is outrageous. And a typical day, what is it for a junior barrister? It's a constant day of working. So they start in the morning, they have their case. Let's say it's one of those cases I mentioned about £96 to go and do a hearing in court. They will have prepared that case the night before. Some of them diligently will have worked until the early hours of the night, forsaking sleep, getting up bleary-eyed in the morning, and then getting themselves out of the house onto a train that they've got to pay for, or into a car if they can afford to run one, the fuel they've got to pay for. They've got to get themselves to court. They may be at court the entire day, so they could be there for 5 or 6 hours dealing with that one case. And then they've got to get themselves back home at the end of the day, under their own steam, at their own cost. When they get home, what will they do? Probably grab something to eat if they can quickly knock something together, and then they're going to be working on the case that they've got for the next day. And what will they have earned for that entire day's work and the night before? The princely sum of £96, out of which they've got to pay all of their disbursements, their travel, their train, their tax, the amount that they have to pay to their chambers, which is the rent that we pay to be a member of chambers. When you take all of that out of £96, you will be left with hardly anything. And more likely than not, as junior barristers have said over and over again, they're actually working at a loss. How can people work like that? That's not acceptable. That's unconscionable. So when the public started hearing these stories, it changed their minds, and they realized that the government actually had been misleading them about the reality of what it's like to be a criminal barrister. And they began to understand why so many of these young people had simply given up and couldn't do the job anymore. And when they were told as members of the public that the consequence of losing all these people is that these victims and these innocent defendants were being forced to wait not just months, but years longer to have their cases resolved, there was a sense of outrage emerging in the public's consciousness about this whole situation, the public thinking this is simply not acceptable. So it's not us crying wolf. It's not us exaggerating the problem. All of this has been documented. The statistics are there for everyone to see. None of this is in dispute. The Ministry of Justice can't deny the figures. And what we have said over and over again is we need to come to a settlement that is fair to us and that ensures the long-term sustainability of our profession. And the government needs to do the right thing and implement the recommendations made by their own independent review, which is now nearly a year old and hasn't yet been implemented, and it needs to do it fast. The consequences won't just be to us as individual barristers, in particular junior barristers who will leave the job. The consequences will be inflicted upon a public who will then see justice grinding to a halt and defendants being let out on bail when perhaps they should be in custody, victims not having their day in court, many of them suffering mental harm because of the anxiety and the stress, some people ending their own lives. We've seen that with defendants in custody. We've seen that with victims. Some people engaging in self-harm. The consequences are real. These aren't fanciful things. They're palpable things. And what government's got to get its head around is this is all the result of them being negligent in not taking care of the system up until now. So that's what we've been saying to government over and over again. And we hope finally that our message is getting through to them.
And that actually brings us on to the next point, Jo. Can you share if there have been any meaningful conversations with the government? And do you think that the appointment of the new Lord Chancellor and Secretary of State for Justice is exactly what is needed? Are you able to provide us with any sort of an update?
Well, there are negotiations which are going on as we speak, and we hope that those negotiations are going to resolve at least satisfactorily enough for us to have some sort of interim settlement. Because I think what the criminal bar would love to be able to do, if it can, is to go back to work. After all, every day that we're not in court and working, we are losing money. As I mentioned to you earlier, with the cost of living crisis that we're all engulfed by, that means that people are really struggling to make ends meet. So we all want to see a solution as soon as possible. And across this year, as the chair of the Criminal Bar Association, I've made it my business to keep pushing and pressuring government to resolve this quickly. Government, I'm afraid, turned a deaf ear for most of this year until we began to escalate our action. And it was the decision that was taken democratically by a ballot of our criminal barristers, amongst our criminal barristers, to take action, first in the form of not accepting return work, which means not covering for other colleagues who are double booked. And then we escalated it to having days of action, which meant that we wouldn't go to court in the first week for 2 days, and the second week for 3 days, and so on and so forth until it reached a full working week. And then finally, in the third ballot, Farine, we went as far as we could, which was to have an all-out strike with effect from the 5th of September. And the result of this approach, which we regret having to pursue because we don't want to not be earning money, we don't want to not have victims get their day in court, and we don't want innocent defendants to languish in custody. We want to get this sorted out quickly. Everyone is suffering because of the delay, but it's taken this long for this government to actually get round the table. They could have done this months and months and months ago, but it was their stubbornness and their flat refusal to engage with us. And the previous Secretary of State, Dominic Raab, who I met once on the 25th of November, and despite our exhortations to him to meet with us again, simply buried his head in the sand and didn't want to talk to us. And it was such an immature way of dealing with a profession like our own. The consequence was that we lost a lot of time this year, and we were forced into a position to have to escalate action. But we're here now, and it's quite clear from the indications being given by government that they are now in a position under such enormous pressure from us because of the action that we have taken, that they are forced to the negotiating table. And we hope very much that the result of this soon will be some sort of a settlement that allows us to resume business as usual. There will be other matters that need to be sorted out later in the year and next year. But for now, the key point is we've made a demand that we should be paid an increase of 25% on our fees, and we should have payment for written work, and we should have a pay review body that deals with the annual cycle of considering whether we are still being adequately paid in light of inflationary increases. All of that is absolutely essential to encourage barristers to stay in this job. And if we get a good enough settlement, I think we might be able to slow down the exodus. But if we don't get a good enough settlement, there are many people that I've spoken to at the criminal bar who have said to me, Joe, if this doesn't work out, I'm afraid I've already made preparations to go away and do something else like employment or family law. With great regret, I have to leave. And this is heartbreaking because for every person who leaves, it means there's another broken ambition for people who had dreams that they wanted to pursue. And it means that the system is going to come under such intolerable pressure that everyone else who's captured within the system is going to be suffering as well. So let's hope we get a good result and we get it soon.
Indeed, Joe. Thank you so much for providing us with that update. Now, during a recent interview, you mentioned that the government is starving the independent bar, the independent criminal bar, I should say, of its resources to make its barristers move on to becoming public defenders. Can you tell our audiences why the independent bar is important and the dangers if it diminished? And if we completely move to a model where we have public defenders like we do in the States, what is the danger of that?
It's absolutely essential, Farine, that we have an independent bar for all sorts of very good reasons. Let me sort of mention a couple of them. Number one, if you are effectively employed by the government as a public defender, and therefore your salary is drawn from the government, that means you are under their control. It means that if they ask you to do something for the money that you're being paid, you'll have to do it. That'll be a term or a condition of your employment contract. That means that people who are left in that position have less latitude to stand up and say, I'm sorry, but I don't agree with what you're asking me to do. Secondly, it's absolutely critical for the health of the criminal justice system that the people that we have doing this job, the prosecutors and defenders, have a degree of autonomy. They must be able to make decisions independently of any pressure being applied to them from whichever source it happens to be. And it could be from a victim, it could be from a defendant, it could be from their instructing solicitor, it could be from government sending out signals to the public that it wants more rapists locked up and it doesn't care what it takes to achieve that objective. It's essential in a democracy to have people who are involved in the justice system who are able to resist that pressure. So when the government has threatened, and it is a threat, they've said very clearly that they want to expand the public defender service, and just be clear about what a minuscule service that is at the moment. There are only 28 people in the entire country who are employed as public defenders. They sit in Petty France in central London. They do a job that obviously is limited in terms of the volume of work that they can handle. They in no way can substitute for the nearly 3,000 criminal barristers who are working up and down in courts in the country, up and down the country every single day. So there is no way to increase the public defender service to compensate for the loss that we are seeing, the hemorrhaging that we're seeing from the independent criminal bar. Secondly, government is not being straight with the public about this. The cost to government of increasing the number of employees as public defenders is astronomical. It's always already been costed. Everyone is very clear that when you start adding it up, the salary plus, you've got to give people sickness pay, you've got to give them holiday entitlement, you've got to give them maternity pay, you've got to give them all the national insurance. Everything that goes into employing someone means that the costs of actually increasing the number of people on the roll of public defenders will be huge for the taxpayer. And that's why the government's always relied upon us as the independent criminal bar to deliver for them, because we're cheap. We're extraordinarily cheap. They're getting us to do work for nothing, as I've mentioned before, doing written work, drafting documents, which can take hours, sometimes days to settle. We get paid nothing for it. We're being exploited. In old-fashioned terms, that's what's happening. People are being actually abused economically for their labor. And for the work that they do get paid, as I've mentioned before, it is such a pittance, particularly for junior barristers, that is a form of exploitation. Anyone who's being paid less than minimum wage in reality is being illegally exploited. And that's why government doesn't want to stop us doing this job altogether. It just wants to see how much it can get away with before the numbers fall so low that they have to do something about it. And it's going to be more than a sticking plaster. It requires a proper injection of money into the system and into fees to keep it surviving. So I don't think, actually, even though the government saber rattles about this and says, oh, if you don't do the work and you go on strike, we're going to expand the public defence service. It's actually a hollow threat. I don't believe it at all. But it does remind us of why it's important, as you've asked, to have an independent profession. It really, really is critical. And I think it will be a very sad day in our society if the justice system is run only by people who are employed by the government. Because then when you get a government which has a particular agenda from the top down, that will percolate to the rank and file employees on the ground, that you've got to deliver a certain agenda, which means that people aren't making decisions based upon an objective analysis of the case or the evidence. They're beginning to feel pressure from above that they've got to deliver certain results or indeed meet certain targets. And we know that this government has been very keen on setting targets. And we all know that once you set targets, people will modify and change their behavior in order to reach those targets rather than to discharge their professional responsibilities, which is to administer justice in an objective and impartial fashion.
Absolutely. And I think the danger, as you've touched on already, Jo, is that it then becomes really difficult to hold the government to account, especially when they roll out these agendas and policies that you've mentioned. I think we can wrap up this section now. Have you any concluding remarks for criminal barristers and our audience, the public members who are listening into this podcast? What would you like to say to them, Jo?
I'd like to say this. I hope that through the course of this year, with the action that we've taken, which has highlighted how deep the crisis is within the criminal justice system, that there's been a better education for the public about the job that we do, and a better understanding and sympathy, actually, for the service that we provide. Because I think up until now, there really was a degree of cynicism amongst the public about complaints coming from the bar. But the criminal bar itself is like the Cinderella of the system. It's really been the poor cousin that needed to be treated much more fairly in order for it to attract the kind of respect that other areas of work habitually attract, other sorts of barristers who do very worthy work, family barristers, employment barristers, and all of the rest. And they're our colleagues after all. But the criminal bar has really been left behind. And I think what I would say is this to members of the public who've been pondering about whether this strike action has been worth it, whether the costs to victims and defendants of the action that we've taken is justifiable. Just think in this way: if junior doctors and nurses, for whom we have huge respect in the NHS, are saying that they are being paid so badly that they cannot tolerate the hours that they're being forced to work for the little pay that they earn any longer, that they are now balloting to go on strike themselves. It should give ordinary members of the public, pause for thought. Why is it that people who clearly are doing a job which is not motivated by money, but by a sense of public service, have reached the limits of their patience and tolerance, that they are actually talking about stopping work altogether, knowing full well that by not working, if you're in the NHS, patients are going to suffer. If you're in the criminal justice system, victims and defendants are going to suffer. What would drive these good human beings, these good men and women, to the point where they feel they have no choice but to withdraw their labor? And it's really a moment of reckoning for us as a society. Have we got things so badly wrong? Are we lifting the cap on bankers' bonuses, as this government is now promoting, at the expense of thinking about the ordinary foot soldiers in society who keep the wheels of our society turning every single day? When we had COVID and we had 2020 and we were applauding and clapping outside our houses for NHS workers because we recognized the value of what they were doing, they were saving people's lives, and we were prepared to do that. And now we see those same people saying, I'm sorry, but I'm going to be forced to go on strike. And the same patients that I was looking after before are going to suffer in consequence of that. It's a wake-up call for the public to realize that what government is doing is favoring people who are rich, people who are in professions who are earning absurd amounts of money, favoring corporates and companies who are making billions of pounds of profits from energy supply, and at the same time telling the foot soldiers, the humble workers who are keeping our society afloat, whether it's in providing healthcare or providing legal services or providing trains or providing anything else, teaching, education, all of that. Where are our priorities? Do we care about them? If we care about them, we should listen to them, and we should make sure that they stay in those professions and pay them properly to do it, rather than favoring other sectors of society who are already making huge amounts of money, and not skewing our democracy so that it favors the rich at the expense of the poor and increasing those income disparities. Barristers doing criminal legal aid work are now in the same position as people who are working in supermarkets in terms of what they are earning at the junior end. How did that ever happen? How could it be allowed to happen? Don't we want people to be skilled? Don't we want them to go to university? Don't we want them to get degrees and get professional qualifications? Well, if we do, let's make sure that when they leave those universities and go off and become lawyers or doctors, that we pay them properly and pay them enough to do the job. Not big sums of money, not sums of money that are going to make them rich, but just enough to make them want to stay so that they can serve the public, which is exactly what they wanted to do in the first place. It's what they signed up for, and which many of them really want to commit themselves to again, but they need support from government in order to do that.
Thank you so much, Jo. You've given me goosebumps, if I'm honest. That was powerful. Thank you very much. We now want to get to know you, Jo Sidhu KC. So I'm going to ask you two fun questions. The first question, Jo, can you tell our audiences, what is your favourite hobby or activity outside of the barrister's role? What do you like to do?
Well, having mentioned that barristers have precious little time when they're not in court because they're working on other things in the evenings and weekends, I wish I could tell you that I had a really interesting hobby. My hobbies have changed over time, and I've always tried to take care of my health and go to the gym and keep myself fit. I've tried to keep my health as good as I can by eating well, by not drinking, and doing the things which will hopefully give me enough energy to keep doing this job. But one of the things I enjoy doing is walking. One of my favorite places is Kew Gardens. I love going to Kew Gardens if I can go on or every Sunday I would. I also like relaxing in front of the television, the normal things that people do, and I try and keep up with current affairs and news and educate myself about things. I mean, it's really important to be on top of other things, not just the law. I try and read when I can. I started off as a social science student, so I try and read into subjects which it interests me, that have always been there for me, talking about social affairs, current affairs, cultural issues. I try and do podcasts like this to share with people what I've learned. I do a lot of voluntary teaching, advocacy training. It's not a hobby, but for me, it's a passion. And it's something that I've always enjoyed doing, to share with other people, particularly younger barristers, what I've learned by way of advocacy techniques over the last 3 decades. And so there's lots of things that I do like to do, and fitting them all in is really the trick. But hobbies wise, I think my hobbies are pretty modest. I think that my intention is that I'll do all the things that I wanted to do when I retire, but whilst I'm still working and I'm still healthy, I want to do as many of the things that I can to help people get into this profession, to keep it diverse, and to do my bit as well in expressing my opinions about broader issues within society, on media and elsewhere, because I think it's important that those of us who come from certain backgrounds do share that with the public. And keep in mind, Farine, I mean, I'm a boy who started from Southall. It was an immigrant community, and I grew up with people who were effectively second generation migrants. And we were this, that was instilled in us from a very young age from our parents, that you've got to make the most of this life. If people have traveled 4,500 miles to resettle in the UK, then the least they should expect from their children is to grasp every opportunity that's afforded to them, and to not waste time, not to lose time, to try and do the best they can for the community around them, which is why voluntary work for me in my hometown has been really important. I've got myself involved in environmental issues and campaigns, because I believe that once you get certain skills, as an advocate has at the bar, it's really important to ensure that you share those skills in other areas of life, not just in law. So if you're a good communicator, you're good at marshalling information, you're good at speaking to members of the public, then try and do that in other ways, in voluntary work. It could be at school, it could be in a local community centre, it could be representing people who are being hard done by their local council or by central government. But do something, stand up and speak, be courageous, because people are looking at you when you've got those skills and you've got that education behind you, because they need you to do those things for those communities. Because if you don't, then you cede the ground to others, and then that's when government and the state leverages its power, and it's a very considerable power, and all the resources that they have to hand, to keep people who are suffering from injustice under their heel. And I can't tolerate that. As someone who spent their entire life fighting against racism and discrimination, I was on demonstrations as a boy in Southall from the age of 10, and I spent most of my time in the voluntary sector actually fighting against injustice. I don't want to see a society in which little people, and I am one of those little people, I am a citizen just like anyone else, gets a hard deal from government. We need our independent advocates, we need our strong voices, we need more people to get on board, because if we do that, we can build a society that is more balanced, more healthy, and doesn't have the disparities that we've seen over the last number of years.
So we're now moving on to our last question of this podcast. Is there a moment in your work life which has troubled you? So let's say a case in court or anything like that you'd like to share with our audiences.
It's very interesting that the perception of criminal barristers is that we're a really, really tough bunch with skin, the thickness of a rhino's hide, that we are impermeable, we don't feel emotions, we operate like robots, we're exposed to all sorts of traumatic and graphic things, whether you're doing a murder case and you're looking at post-mortem photographs, or you're dealing with trauma suffered by victims, which could be pretty extreme in many cases that we deal with. Somehow there's this idea that, barristers, they do this every day, so a bit like, an A&E doctor, they've seen so many people coming in with wounds and they just stitch them up and it doesn't affect them and they don't take it home with them. Well, they do, and we do as well. And it's really important, because the effects of trauma, not just on victims and on bystanders and witnesses who see terrible things happen, whether it's a murder or they're exposed to some awful violence, doesn't just affect them, it affects us too. It's called vicarious trauma. because we are exposed on a daily basis to things that members of the public don't ordinarily get to see. And it's necessary that we are exposed to those things in order for us to be able to do our job properly, just as indeed a doctor would have to do if they were working in a hospital. But there is an effect, and it does impact our sense of mental well-being. Just to give you an example, I did a case at the end of 2019, which was at the Old Bailey. It was the trial of Joseph McCann. Joseph McCann was charged with a very large number of serious sexual offences, and the victims that he inflicted those offences upon ranged in age from about 12 up to about 74. In effect, he went on a rape rampage across the country for a period of 2 weeks before he was eventually apprehended. And when I did that trial at the Old Bailey, representing him, I found it extremely difficult because the material that we were dealing with was children who had been seriously sexually assaulted by him, and an old lady who had been seriously sexually assaulted by him, and everybody in between, women who had been kidnapped before they were assaulted by him. And the one thing that I will always remember about that trial, which pushed me and all the other barristers literally to the edge, was when the prosecution had to play to the jury a 999 call that was made by a 17-year-old girl who had been raped by this man repeatedly during the night. And in order to escape him from her own home, she had jumped out of the first floor bedroom window and landed on the floor below and broken her ankle and ran down the road to her grandmother's house to sound the alarm. And when she went to her grandmother's house, naked as she was covered by her grandmother with a blanket just to give her some modesty. And then she had to make the call to sound the alarm to the police about what was going on. And that call lasted about 20 minutes. And it was the worst 20 minutes, I think, in my entire life, because all of us in a courtroom which had pin drop silence had to listen to this teenage girl sobbing and crying down the phone to the police operator, telling them that this man who had raped her had threatened that if she tried to escape the house, he would murder her 12-year-old brother and her mother, who was tied up in the next bedroom. And she was sobbing and crying, thinking that by escaping from that man, she had sealed the death warrants of her family members. And we found it completely intolerable to listen to. The jury were in tears. The whole courtroom was traumatized. And it was the longest 20 minutes of my life. And at the end of that recording being played, the judge had to tell the jury to leave because he could see that they were so distraught. And it just really brings home to many people who aren't familiar with the jobs that we do, that sometimes we have to remember, as human beings, we have feelings, we have sensitivities. We don't have skin that's so thick that we can't feel it. We're not so inured to all of this trauma that we can tolerate it every day. It takes its toll on us too, which is why, exactly why, I feel that the job that we do deserves to be respected, deserves to be recognized, and deserves to be remunerated properly for all that people put themselves through to do this job. It's not an easy job. Now, it has some wonderful things attached to it, the people that you work with, the cases that you do, the skills that you have to deploy, but they're mixed with all the other things that you have to tolerate, which is the poor working conditions and the material that you're exposed to. And I think we need to have a more mature understanding in modern society about the work that professionals like us do. So what I'd like people to take away from all of this is perhaps a rounder, clearer, and more balanced perception of what a criminal barrister is. And yes, I do ask the public to have some sympathy for us when we take the action that we are taking, so that they figure out for themselves that this is happening because people who do this job are actually decent human beings and they deserve to be treated as such.
Jo, it's been absolutely incredible to have you on here today. I've learned so much from you, and I'm sure our audiences will join me in saying that it's been an absolute honor to have you, and to have you, go through the reality of practicing at the criminal bar. A lot of it that people don't actually see sitting at home or on the road, if you like. So it's been incredibly useful, and thank you very much indeed for your time today.
It's been a pleasure, Farine. Thanks for having me.
This brings us to an end. I want to start off by saying a huge thank you to our sponsors, White Rose Blackman Solicitors, who are based in Leeds. Do head onto their website at www.whiteroseblackmans.co.uk and remember to give them a follow on Twitter and Facebook. Make sure to reach out to them if you require any legal assistance in their specialist practice areas. Do also subscribe to this channel and follow Law Simplified on all social media platforms, inclusive of TikTok. Our TikTok handle is @LawSimplifiedUK. Do also head on to our website at www.law-simplified.co.uk and check out all of our resources so that you are always in contact with the law. Thank you very much indeed. I am your podcast host, Farine Ali. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for tuning in.